Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. So my name is Mathilde Mazati-Placi, and I'm co-convener of UCL Law's South Asia Legal Forum. So our aim is to organize events so as to promote legal and political issues within South Asia. And we are very delighted to have so many of you attend our first event of the year. So first, I would like to introduce our fantastic speakers who have joined us tonight. So first, we have Dr. Madhura Vasaratnam. She is a lecturer in comparative politics at the City University of London. Her research interests are conflict and conflict management, theories of ethnicity and nationalism, civil wars and interventions, and she has made particular contributions to the study of Sri Lankan politics and history. She has written a book, Tamils and the Nation, India and Sri Lanka Compared, where, as the title suggests, she compares how the Tamil question has been engaged with in the two countries, and she makes important contributions to comparative politics and social anthropology regarding the relationship between ethnic identities and the nation state. So thank you, Dr. Vasaratnam, for joining us tonight. We also have with us tonight Ms. Natasha Palansuria, who is joining us all the way from Sri Lanka. She is a senior researcher at the Center for Poverty Analysis, which is an independent Sri Lankan think tank whose work aims to promote a more thorough understanding of poverty-related development issues, as well as the policies that can be developed to tackle these issues. She is also at the same time a PhD candidate at the City University of London, where she is researching the dynamics of engaging Sri Lankan Tamil diasporas in the country's transitional justice project. To that effect, her broader research interests and experience lie in post-conflict justice, transitional politics, and diaspora studies. Ms. Natasha Palansuria, thank you so much for joining us tonight. In order to provide a uniform background to the discussion, I will summarize the history of the Sri Lankan Civil War quite quickly and its legacy, and I will provide a very short definition of transitional justice. So Sri Lanka is largely composed of two groups, the Sinhalese and the Sri Lankan Tamil. So overall, both groups enjoy significant religious and linguistic differences. During British imperial rule, the Tamils were favored, and tensions rose between the two groups after independence in 1948, when Sinhalese began entering the ranks of government. What followed was systemic disenfranchisement of the Tamils through measures such as the establishment of Sinhala as the official language and so on. So these discriminatory policies led to the idea of the Tamil Eelam, a separate Tamil state. So for many of us who are studying in Western institutions and are onlookers, this might seem to be an extreme idea, but it's important to note the very strong identities that these two groups have developed, as well as the fact that, for example, Sinhalese inhabit parts of the island and the Tamil inhabit other parts. So Tamil Eelam can be interpreted as having expressed more of a formalization of conceived pre-existing divisions. So tensions eventually erupted into a civil war in 1986 between the government forces and the major separatist military group, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, or LTTE. This lasted until May 2009 with the defeat of the LTTE. Throughout the conflict, massive human rights violations occurred, including widespread forced disappearances and extrajudicial executions. So although the civil war ended 11 years ago now, the same tensions have continued. For example, the International Truth and Justice Project has documented a continuation of illegal detention and torture methods between 2015 and 2017 alone. So the legacy of the conflict is very much alive. Furthermore, it seems that since 2009, there has not been a genuine attempt to confront the country's violent past. So this speaks to the question of transitional justice, which I will explain in a moment. So as time passes, this inability or unwillingness to deal with the conflict's legacy has been compounded by mounting international pressure. In 2015, a new pro-West coalition government came to power, displacing the ruling Rajapaksa family and triggering hopes from the international community that accountability might finally come about. With this ascent to power came a pledge that an ambitious transitional justice and reform program would be implemented in 2015. So this pledge came in the form of various unilateral statements and also a more concrete UN General Assembly resolution. However, 5 years on, it might be argued that hopes for accountability have very much diminished. So for example, in 2016, Sri Lanka sent a policeman who had famously run a torture site in Colombo, the capital, as part of its delegation to the Geneva Convention Against Torture. Despite international protests, the policeman continued his employment when he returned to Sri Lanka. In 2019, Mahinda Rajapaksa became Prime Minister of Sri Lanka. So the question of just how much the international community can do to pressure the Sri Lankan government, or how much we can expect from Sri Lanka on its own, will be a major theme in today's discussion. So just to wrap up, so what is transitional justice? Transitional justice is best described as the way in which countries emerging from periods of conflict and or repression can address large-scale human rights violations that are seen as so systemic that the judiciary or legislator cannot deal with them on its own. Usually this process takes place during a political transition, so think of the fall of apartheid in South Africa or the end of a dictatorship, but it can take place years later. Also, what makes transitional justice different from normal human rights review that we as law students or the law faculty might encounter more frequently is its focus on victims and the rebuilding of social trust within the society. Thus, in order to be effective, victims really have to believe in the integrity and accountability of the transitional justice system. Lastly, what makes it really important is its flexibility. The measures that are implemented can really vary depending on the conflict's legacy and what the society wants at that time, as well as the type of human rights abuses that occurred. So with the stage now set, I'd like to ask our speakers a general question, perhaps to ease us into this difficult topic. So Madhura, Natasha, how has the Civil War affected relations between the Tamil and Sinhalese and the government? Did you perhaps perceive a noticeable change in either the government or Sri Lankan society after the Civil War or after the 2015 pledge?
I can let Madhura go with the first part if she wants to, and I can continue with the second part of your question.
Okay, so I guess how did the Civil War shape social relations? I think what I would say is that the Civil War has kind of constituted, or the ethnic conflict has constituted Sri Lanka's post-independence history and politics, right? So escalating ethnic conflict has kind of defined Sri Lanka's history as an independent state. So there isn't really kind of Sri Lanka as an entity in which this ethnic conflict didn't exist. So it became independent in 1948. 1956 were the first kind of anti-Tamil riots or pogrom, whatever you want to call it. So within a decade, actually within a year, 1949, sort of Tamil speakers from India who were working as plantation workers in the central parts of the island were disenfranchised. That was within a year, right? So it's really hard that I guess what's difficult to think of is a time before conflict for Sri Lanka, because Sri Lanka's kind of history as an independent state is marked through this conflict. But what I will say is that in studies of conflict from the sort of the political science angle, it's really important to distinguish between day-to-day relations and structural relations. So day-to-day relations may go on fine, right? In border areas, in places like Colombo, whatever. On the day-to-day level, people need to get things done. People need to catch taxis. People need to buy food. People have neighbors, all kinds of things, right? But that doesn't necessarily tell us that at the structural level, things are fine, right? Because even, let's say, in Sri Lanka, at kind of today or tomorrow, there may be no overt ethnic violence, but then all of a sudden there will be, right? And it seems to come out of nowhere, but of course it doesn't come out of nowhere. There are these underlying conditions that facilitated a particular type of state, a particular type of set of social relations. So what I would say is that modern social and political relations between the main ethnic groups have been shaped by the ethnic conflict, and this is crucial. Sri Lanka is a majoritarian state. So what the state is has been shaped by conflict. There is no kind of status quo ante that we can go to and find this perfect liberal, multicultural, multiracial state that somehow if we just ended the conflict, it would just revert, because we don't have a place to go back to. Right? We don't have an origin story of that moment of inclusion. So I would say that, we are the history that we've been through, right? So it's not about going back to a past, it's about what are the conditions in which a different future might emerge?
To carry on from that, for your second part of your question, if there have been noticeable changes that took place after the 2015 pledge, I would not base all of it on the 2015 pledge or the UN resolution, but it's an overall, after 2015, there was an overall change in the political atmosphere of the country. And after the election of the National Unity Government in 2015, there was more space actually than ever before for minority voices to be heard. And there was space for civil society to speak about injustices faced by minorities and to ask for real changes. So although the the transitional justice process was still slow, there was effort and there was perceived political will that eased some of the tensions. As Madhura mentioned, separating the day-to-day relations and the structural relations, if I'm going to talk a bit about the day-to-day, the relations between Tamils and Sinhalese in Sri Lanka, although there was still prejudices from both sides, there was still bubbling issues. The fact that the war was over, I'm not saying the conflict, but the actual war, civil war was over. The LTTE occupied areas were open, the north and east were developed, trade was encouraged. So the Sinhalese were able to travel to the north and east and be exposed to the war, after effects of the war. And also Tamils were all right to travel to Colombo and to the south as well. So I would say that it helped improve the relationship between Sinhalese and Tamils on the surface, but there were still unanswered questions, there were still grievances and justice that needed to be served for real changes to take place.
I just want to develop some of what Natasha has said. So yes, I mean, after the war ended, the war obviously, that state of conflict had ended, but it's important to note that not just the conflict has ended, but Sri Lanka remains deeply militarized, right? So this idea of development in the north, development means development of military camps. That's what it means in the north, right? So the military to civilian ratio, remember, Sri Lanka's military, it was actually quite multi-ethnic. Originally in the colonial era, there was a reasonable proportion of Tamils in it. It's now 100% exclusively Sinhala Buddhist military. The military is largely stationed in the north and east. Sri Lanka is a population of 20 million. The military is 400,000. So to give you an example, Britain is 65 million. The military is about 150,000, right? It's a nuclear armed state. It's a member of the Security Council. Okay, so that just gives you the disproportionate size of the military. But also the military is completely stationed in the war-affected areas of the Northeast. And in some parts of the Northeast, there's a military to civilian ratio of 1 soldier for every 2 to 3 civilians, right? These are the same soldiers who've been involved in war crimes and abductions and sexual abuse, et cetera, so it's really important to note that although there was some freedom of movement for some people, the state of militarization didn't really change in many parts of the north and east.
Natasha, do you have anything to add to that?
Not really. I think Madhura's covered that, and I agree. Yeah.
Right. So then, thank you in particular for the distinction between the ending of the war and the continuation of the conflict, because what particularly interested me was actually the idea that just because the war ended in 2009 does not mean that we don't have these quite regular skirmishes as well. And continuing on from what actually Madhura said about the continued presence of the military, then you also are sort of perfectly placed to answer this, I guess. But through your studies on political violence and relations between ethnic identities and the nation state, then what impact does marked political violence during internal conflicts or continued after conflicts have on the society? And is there any way that's particular about how Sri Lanka has actually dealt with the political violence that took place during the war? So what is really different between the political violence that took place during the war and then after, as we continue the conflict?
Yeah, hi. So, I mean, from my perspective, I would say that, what you have are different forms of violence, right? So if you think about state violence, it can be kinetic, in military strategic terms, it can be kinetic, it can be a cluster bomb, right? Or it can be taking your land. This is what's happening in the north and east, right? It can be taking your land, depriving you of a livelihood. It can be, if you're a mother of the disappeared and you're protesting to find out where your child is, it can be 2 or 3 officers following your every move and listening to every phone conversation you have, right? So that, for me, that's a form of structural violence, right? Like, I don't see that we have to see violence as a continuum, right? So if we see violence as a continuum, then we have had different types of violence in Sri Lanka. We've had the explosive violence of the pogrom. We've had the violence of the war, right? Insurgent violence, counterinsurgent violence, state violence, LTTE violence, etc. Kinetic violence, fast violence. But we also have slow structural violence that is just ongoing. So to give you an example, the north and east, which is now hugely deprived, hugely impoverished, right, relative to the rest of the country, at the moment of independence was actually relatively prosperous with regards to the rest of the country, right? Relatively quite well developed. The agriculture was really, really efficient, right? Incomes were relatively high. That's completely turned around. That doesn't just happen through the kind of forceful violence. That happens through a set of policies, a set of practices. You can see in the Northeast, every time, last time I went to Jaffna, it's kind of the spaces in which there's possibility for Tamil economic activity are so severely constrained by the military, right? The military runs the hairdressing salons, right? So it's that to me, what I would say is that this is why I think it's important to note the conflict continues, and we can't compare Sri Lanka, for example, to South Africa, where there was a structural change, or even Northern Ireland after the Good Friday Agreement, or even Nepal, because the kind of the directionality of violence, from my perspective, just continues in a different way.
So Natasha, would you like to add anything? Because I would also like to ask for your expertise in terms of evaluating considering this very deep-rooted national history in all these types of violence, then how can we evaluate the efforts that have been made at transitional justice so far, considering this immense history?
Yes, so the process has been extremely slow. It has been more than 10 years since the end of the war, and there has been very limited progress towards reconciliation, transitional justice towards reconciliation. If I may go through the trajectory real quickly. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the United People's Freedom Alliance, which was led by Mahinda Rajapaksa, because of international pressure to investigate the final stages of the war, appointed the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission, which I'll refer to as LLRC, in May 2010. So the LLRC, just to remind, I'm sure most of you know, but the war ended in 2009. So in May 2010, they appointed the LLRC. It inquired into events which led to the failure of the Ceasefire Agreement, and from 2002 up to 2009, and followed on lessons with a view of non-recurrence and restitution. It got a lot of criticism from the United Nations, but also from all around. After the LLRC produced a report in November 2011, in July 2012, a national plan of action was drawn up by the Rajapaksa government to implement the recommendations. But out of the 189 recommendations made in the LLRC, only 19 recommendations were implemented. 59 recommendations saw partial progress, and 95 recommendations made poor progress. This was according to the United Nations Development Programme's evaluation of it. After the LLRC report, the United Nations Human Rights Council requests the OHCHR in Colombo to carry out an investigation on Sri Lanka in 2014. The investigation recommended the development of a comprehensive policy and consultations of the transitional justice mechanisms, and public education of transitional justice. So after this came the change in government in January 2015. They did not follow through with the National Plan of Action drawn up by the Mahinda Rajapaksa government, but they did co-sponsor the UNHRC resolution 30/1, which you referred to as the 2015 pledge. So through this, they made ambitious commitments to establish several transitional justice measures to promote reconciliation, accountability, and human rights in Sri Lanka. Among the commitments, the 4 mechanisms that were crucial, what's leading the conversation now, is setting up of a judicial mechanism with special counsel with the participation of Commonwealth and foreign judges. The second was setting up of a Truth Commission, so the Truth, Justice and Reconciliation and Non-Recurrence Commission. Establishing an Office for Reparations and establishing an Office of Missing Persons. So after this resolution was co-sponsored, the cabinet declared a national policy on durable solutions for conflict-affected displacement. This was in 2016. So following this resolution, this then was introduced, a national policy on reconciliation was introduced in 2017. So among the 4 mechanisms that I mentioned, the Office on Missing Persons Act was passed in Parliament in August 2016 and operationalized in 2018. So there was a 2-year gap there between the passing of the act and the operationalization. They did provide an interim report. They had consultations with about 2,000 affected people across the country. They also did operationalize and open offices, etc. Then the Office for Reparations Act was passed in 2019. However, there was a lot of criticism that the act was passed without public consultations, and therefore grassroots and the victims had no say in it and also had no awareness of it. So there were other areas of progress, if I can mention them quickly. There was some release of land in the northern eastern provinces, but as Madhura mentioned, there's still a constant battle going on for the land to be returned to rightful owners. There was ratification of International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearances. The enactment, they criminalized enforced disappearances by bringing in a new legislation as well. And they did a lot to strengthen the National Human Rights Commission, so within this period. And they established a national authority to protect victims of crimes and witnesses in 2016. But there are these areas that had seen no progress. The Commission of Truth. The people are confused. I mean, the masses, or even I think it's more the communication about these mechanisms that are getting a lot of pushback. So there's no proper communication, obviously, and political agendas that twist and turn what these actually do. So the Commission for Truth, Justice and Reconciliation has seen no progress at all. Judicial mechanism is a big no-no, big taboo in the country. It doesn't even they don't even want to talk about it or even draft a legislation for it. Security sector reform, also another aspect that hasn't seen any progress. And the Prevention of Terrorism Act, even though they proposed a Counter-Terrorism Act bill, it has not been passed in Parliament, so the PTA is still standing, and the government still uses the PTA to make arrests and detentions. There's been also no progress on a political settlement by a constitutional reform. So although the institutional architecture has, let's say, come up a little bit, to take the process forward, there is not enough concrete results or infrastructure or structure to actually take the process further.
Right, so the legal kind of mechanism has begun, but we just haven't, I guess, put meat on the bones or put substance to it yet.
Yeah, and also because of election of a new government, it's really unlikely that any of this will be taken forward. I feel like, I mean, it's quite obvious because even the constitution was changed, and the president's responsibility to promote reconciliation, that line has been taken off. So, I mean, those are some things, but then there are also loads of things happening within the country that shows us that maybe there's a standstill again. I don't know if it will move forward, but also the new government has notified the UN Human Rights Council that they would not, they would like to withdraw from the resolution, and they would like to take on a internally, nationally run process. So we really don't know what will happen to what's been established so far and how it will go forward from here. It's still unclear.
Right. So then I guess this makes a bit moot my next question, also because Madura very, I think, precisely gave us a sense of how unique Sri Lanka's situation is. But do you, I guess, could any lessons be learned from other experiences in transitional countries?
Like you said, it's a very unique context, and you have to look at the context as well. But if I, for example, take South Africa, because it's an iconic case of transitional justice, it can't be directly compared to Sri Lanka because the context is different, the power dynamics are different. And the peace in Sri Lanka, in quotes, is considered a victor's peace. So, but there are some lessons to be learned from the process itself. For example, there were huge consultative processes that took place before the transitional justice process or the constitutional reform process started. There was input, so there needs to be input from all parts of society. So the consultation, there was a consultation task force established in Sri Lanka that conducted consultations right after the 2015 resolution, and they had 7,000 submissions. But that's only a fraction of the entire population. And also, it needs to be more coherent. So even though they did collect statements, a lot of the grassroots, the ground level people were a bit confused. They were not aware of exactly what they needed to speak to the CTF about. So they did come to the CTF with grievances. So there's a lot of recording of witness statements and grievances and all of that. But then the reports are now in the National Archives. So we don't even to get access to it. It's a very huge process as well. And also we're not sure exactly who houses this properly now. So we need to have proper consultations to know what the victims and the ground level and civil society want from the process. Then the second I would say is that looking at the South African example, the institutions should be independent, first of all. It shouldn't have any political interference. It should be independent. It should be properly resourced. So in a country like Sri Lanka, the TJ mechanisms, the Transition Office of Missing Persons, or Office of Reparations, they probably get the least amount of funding or no funding at all, especially with current government. And also these institutions need to be given proper investigative powers. But while the transition was successful in South Africa, there are still aspects that haven't been completed, and victims are still asking for justice and reparations. So I think another lesson to be learned is that if you are doing this, you do it seriously. You can't promise things that you can't give, and leave victims shortchanged. So I would say those are probably the three learnings that we could take from the South African case.
Okay, thank you. And so then turning to Madura, she has been listening very, very attentively. So as Natasha just said, we can kind of see that Sri Lanka seems to be withdrawing from its international commitments. Would that be a fair way of putting it, Natasha?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So then, Madhura, how can we expect, or should we expect, Sri Lanka to be able to deal with this on its own? And considering, as Natasha alluded to, that we still have some form of a deep state, and as you also discussed, we have continuing forms of political violence. So widespread impunity regarding illegal abductions, torture of political activists. We have these forms of political violence that have continued, and we see Sri Lanka turning in on itself. So can we expect anything to really happen in one way or another?
Okay, thank you for that. So, what I would say is that, yes, of course. I mean, I think I agree that Sri Lanka is definitely kind of pulling back from those international commitments. But what I would kind of there's also a different perspective to this, which is that the international is always present in Sri Lanka in some form of another, right? And whatever happens in Sri Lanka happens through a mixture of local and international dynamics working together. The war itself was, you know, in terms of the literature on civil wars, it could be said it was constituted by this transnational dynamics of force, right? Sri Lanka at the time when the surge of violence in 2005, 2006, when there was a massacre of Tamil civil society, that was, you know, this huge surge in disappearances called the Shadow War. This was at the height of the war on terror, right? So, you know, you can't really disentangle Sri Lanka from the international. So, and just to point back to the other cases also, if you think about South Africa, whatever progress was made in South Africa, it didn't happen internally. It wasn't that, you know, the apartheid government suddenly woke up and said, yesterday we were racist, today we've seen the light, let's have majority rule. No, that never happens. You don't have a racist genocidal state go to bed one night as a racist genocidal state, wake up the next morning having had an epiphany, transformed. It happened because the Cold War ended, right? And South Africa's major backers said, enough, right? So it's got time to change, right? The time has come, okay? And they called time on apartheid. So these are also the dynamics in which Sri Lanka is situated. Sri Lanka's domestic conflict is situated. My reading of it, you know, and the one I kind of put out in my book, it's not particularly popular, but that's the one I kind of makes the most sense to me, is that in its post-independence history, Sri Lanka's had a pretty good ride from the international, the state, I mean, right, in terms of its capacity to kind of really persecute minorities. First Tamils, now increasingly Muslims. You know, it must be noted at the moment, this absolutely horrific thing where like Muslim people who pass away have to be cremated for no good public health reason, none, right? I mean, it's such a deep, deep violation, right? You know, as a kind of fairly devout Hindu, like if my loved ones had to be buried, it would be equally appalling, right? So it's had a pretty good ride, but I think the moments at which there's pressure are the moments in which it gives ways. And why I think there hasn't been systemic change, as we've seen in South Africa, as we've seen in Northern Ireland, as we've seen in Nepal, is because for all kinds of contingent reasons that pressure hasn't been sustained, right? So, you know, the Indian intervention, 1987, led to the first recognition by the Sri Lankan state that the Tamils existed on the island, right? The 13th Amendment, it's part of the, I think they're going to get rid of that too, but it's, you know, it was the first time that there was a kind of recognition that Tamils have a collective existence on the island, right? Then in, you know, 1999, 2001, the Ceasefire Agreement, again, through international dynamics, right? Ceasefire Agreement, the Norwegian peace process. And then I would say even 2005, the fall of the Mahinda Rajapaksa regime, that doesn't happen in isolation from the ways in which international actors shape Sri Lanka, right? And the types of international pressure that are mobilized, including by the diaspora for transitional justice. So, I mean, you can't take that away, that huge kind of transnational network of advocacy, including the diaspora, that really pushed for this as building up momentum towards the 2015 commitment. That didn't come from within Sri Lanka, right? Any more than majority rule came from within the apartheid state, right? So I would say going forward, there's of course, you know, I can't predict because I think it's linked to kind of these political dynamics, but I think that, you know, that again, it'll be shaped by the dynamics of the international and the local and how these engage with each other. I mean, what I would say in that sort of gives me a sense of the openness of possibilities, that unlike the apartheid states, Sri Lanka is actually relatively weak, right? It's hugely debt-ridden, I mean, massively debt-ridden, has very weak finances. It's recently been downgraded first by Fitch and then by Moody's. And secondly, also, hugely debt-ridden state, but also, like, in terms of just its strategic presence, there is this oversized military, but this is not a military that's ever has, or possibly can, fight a significant war with another state, right? It's one thing to harass the parents of the disappeared. It's quite another to fight a different state, right? So for those reasons, I don't really just look at what the leadership in Colombo does to try and kind of fathom the possibilities of what happens in Sri Lanka. It's difficult to look too far in the future, but one might think that, for example, had the US election gone the other way, we might be facing a different set of propositions, right? Given that we have a Biden administration, they've made commitments to reestablishing a liberal order, multilateralism, all these kinds of things. So I would say that in 2013, 2012, we couldn't have predicted that the Sri Lankan government would be in a position where it was accepting the UN resolution, right? And the thing about accepting the UN resolution for me is also not the kind of the institutional processes that it sets up, which are significant, but as someone who studies politics from the kind of symbolic, constructive aspects of it, what's really significant, again, is the first time the Sri Lankan state accepts that mass atrocities took place, right? No questions asked, right? There were mass atrocities, they were illegal, right? So that was the first kind of actual acknowledgement. Remember this, soon after the end of the war, nobody has died. It was a humanitarian rescue operation, right? That was the kind of noise coming from Colombo. So to get from there within 6 years to saying, okay, fine, what the UN report says about all these horrific crimes, that happened, is a big kind of step. So I would say, I don't, looking at it from the kind of the general sense of the configuration of domestic and transnational forces, provides the possibility of more avenues of change and reconfiguration.
Before I ask a follow-up question, Natasha, would you like to add anything to that answer?
I think Madhura has covered that. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So then, looking to Sri Lanka's quite sizable big brother in India, then Madhura, how would you then describe any impact, if it has had any, that India might have had on Sri Lanka's perhaps road to reconciliation, if it is on it anymore, or what impact it might have in the future on sort of maybe exerting some pressure to have some future promises?
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think that is the crucial question that faces Sri Lanka, and I think that's probably kind of like the question about Sri Lanka and its kind of future dynamics at the moment. And it's really prescient, but I don't have a clear answer of what will happen, but I think there are some indications that we can look at to see, these factors are significant. So the first factor is, of course, this sense of, a reshaping of global order and a reshaping of international power, right? And a kind of set of tensions about how China, India, the US, the EU will reshape this global order, and how they will and will not coexist. So Sri Lanka, Maldives, Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan, these are all sites at which this conflict is unfolding. So Sri Lanka, of course, like all these other states, is a space in which there are contestations about, that idea of creating an Indo-Pacific alliance, right? Between India, Western states, Australia, Japan, and what role Sri Lanka would have in that, whether Sri Lanka kind of wants to or whether Sri Lanka will become part of a China, a Sinosphere, if you like. how these will coexist. So these are one set of contestations in which this will be decided. What I would say in Sri Lanka's case is, though, geography is very limiting, right? So you can see India from bits of Sri Lanka, right? So that you can't kind of haul the island over to the coast of China. Like, it's just, that's not going to happen. So like that puts a real limit in terms of just the military strategic thinking about, I would argue. This is not the same as Pakistan, where the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor joins straight up to Western China, right? Sri Lanka is different. It's, geography is constrains those kinds of possibilities. The other thing I would say is also, broadly, I mean, Indian policy on Sri Lanka has waxed and waned, has changed in many ways over the decades. But broadly, if you think about what the broad directionality of India's foreign policy is, what it would like in Sri Lanka is just stability and access, right? So access in terms of access to trade routes. And the key thing here is that the Indian economy was growing. The Indian leadership would like it to continue to grow, to continue to export. It needs to get stuff in and out of the country. And here Sri Lanka is significant because the Colombo port, which is often seen in sort of isolation from India, but it's important to note that 75% of what goes through Colombo's port is transshipment for India, right? So for India then, if you think about a growing economy with strategic interests, what it wants is one of its major ports for its economy to be stable, right? To not have this constant kind of, we'll give you access to the port, we won't give you access to the port, we'll give you access to the port. That's just not possible if you want to think long-term, you want your economy to grow, those kinds of things. So I think those are the kind of spaces within which the Indian perspective on Sri Lanka will be shaped broadly. We've already seen that. I mean, the Indians have pushed really hard to open up an international airport in Jaffna, which happened. It's a small thing, but it's symbolically significant. It also opens up a kind of pipeline really for Jaffna to the south of India, right? They've pushed for another airport in Batticaloa, which again is a Tamil-speaking area. So in all these kinds of ways, there is an attempt to stabilize the island, to make it kind of a stable, cohesive part of an Indian order, really. But of course, what that needs to engage with is Sinhala Buddhist majoritarianism, hostility not just to the minorities, but also to India per se. Because in the kind of mythology of Sinhala Buddhism, Tamils are Indians, who are the remnants of previous, kind of illegitimate invasions 900 years ago, but still, so there's a lot going on there. But I think that India will, if I had to put some money on it, I'm sorry for babbling on so long, but if I had to put money on it, I would say that you're likely to see it's possible that there's likely to be some kind of convergence between India and the US, that some kind of working out of what might be called an Indo-Pacific order, and both India and the US will work in relation to not just Sri Lanka, but Maldives and other states in relation to that.
Thank you. Natasha, do you have, this kind of leads on to what actually contrasts, I guess, with your argument that transitional justice is most effective when it's completely voluntary. So is there, I guess, any space in transitional justice theory or processes for external, I guess, pressure or demands? And how can that fit into, I guess, an internal process that is a bit more voluntary? I guess if we see India and the US converge or be in position of some kind of Indo-Pacific order, how would that then fit into an actually effective transitional justice process in Sri Lanka?
As I see it now, I think the only way that can be like major influence is through economic sanctions, and that's probably the more, I guess, harsh, like the kind of blocking way to go about it. But in transitional justice theory itself, it could be an internally run process, right? It can, obviously for Sri Lanka, having the external support is what kind of got it, I would say, this far in a way. It's not as far as we would like to see it go, but that influence and the fact that Sri Lanka was part of, is a member state of the United Nations, there's pressure from that end. Also, like Madhura mentioned before, the large diaspora population that puts pressure on the host governments, who then influences the international sphere. So without that pressure, I don't know how far this could go. But what I would like to kind of bring to attention is also that if you look at it the other way, the stalling of the transitional justice process, maybe not through this government, but through the previous government, was the fact that there was a lot of pushback because in general, the majority community resisted transitional justice because of what it perceived it to be. And that was obviously persecuting for war crimes, etc. And also that another big thing was the perceived international interference, the threat to sovereignty. So that is a huge cause of contention within the country. It starts from the political sphere, but also kind of trickles down and breathes into what the public perception of it is. So that has been a huge pushback, that has caused huge pushback, which I think has stalled the process also, apart from everything else in this whole context. But looking at Sri Lanka's track record so far, and this government's track record, without the international pressure, I don't know if this would go anywhere. So I don't know if I answered your question directly, but yeah.
Well, I guess to a certain extent, I'm asking a question that has no answer. As Madhura said, we'd probably have to put money on bets. So then I guess this leads me to my last question, which is, I guess I'm asking you to bet now. So what can we really expect in the near future, considering the fact that Sri Lanka is in such a precarious economic position, considering the fact that we also have a pandemic that has exacerbated, I guess, many grassroots attempts at bottom-up, I guess, transitional justice. So how would you see Sri Lanka, I guess, in, what are we, 7 December 2021, where would you see Sri Lanka? Assuming we have a vaccine, maybe.
Do you want me to go with this, Mother? Okay, so I think, so I've kind of given the whole idea of the current political climate, that is unlikely to see any concrete measures, but definitely not through the resolution, because after 2021 is when the UN has given time to Sri Lanka until 2021. So after that, we don't know what's going to happen. So until then, we can hope for something maybe, but then I don't know how the UN is also going to react to this when Sri Lanka withdraws. So leaving that aside, this government has said that they will have a nationally run process with a commission of inquiry headed by Justice of the Supreme Court, etc., and keeping in line with the new government's policy. So this is their words. There's been no measures so far taken towards this. And like you said, with the pandemic and all of that, I mean, things are just being held back. The Office of Missing Persons and Office of Reparations have both been stalled since the election of the new president, Gotabaya Rajapaksa. So again, there's little hope in this regard. And like you said, the process should probably be driven from the ground up, but there have been numerous grassroots projects, especially between 2015 and 2019. Many grassroots projects. There was a huge funding from the United Nations Peace Building Fund that funded a lot of projects to carry out transitional justice work and create awareness. While there has been some attitudinal changes in the grassroots, for something really impactful to come out of this, there has to be political will. And without it, as grave as it sounds, there is really no hope for justice and accountability, I would say. I'd like Madhura to add to it if she has any.
Please.
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with that kind of somewhat pessimistic domestic reading. I don't think domestically there's going to be any shift, but I think there are a couple of things that are really worth pointing out. I mean, none of them are all overwhelmingly positive, but I would say that hopefully there's a vaccine and the economic situation improves somewhat and tourism improves and all these things improve. But I think if they do not, if the economic situation continues to get worse, I think people's suffering will be really terrible. The economic distress will be really terrible. And that will kind of fuel a further sort of ratcheting up of ethnic tensions, if you like, right? I mean, it will. We've already seen these kind of totally kind of unjustifiable really restrictions on Muslims, and we will see others as well. So if the economic pressure kind of ratchets up, then that will happen. But I would also say that, I think that I still don't know how the Sri Lankan government will address the debt issue. I don't know. I'm not sure how they will do that, because that it's kind of on a day-to-day basis, sort of just about managing the risk of default. And that's a very precarious situation to be in. And I would dread to think what might happen should there be a default. I understand they've now asked the IMF to come back in, but that's, it's a double-edged sword, because that just leads to a bunch of austerity measures, which are also quite punishing. So there are those things to watch out for on the economic front. On the political front, though, I think, again, this tension will continue, because I think international pressure, there's possibilities for it to kind of ratchet up again. There's been an uptick of Indian diplomatic activity on the island. There's a kind of slightly more muscular Indian approach to insisting on rights to certain infrastructure projects and that kind of thing. So these are kind of contrasting and conflicting pressures that are at play in Sri Lanka. So I would say it's actually quite volatile. It's actually, I mean, like much of the world, it feels quite volatile.
So this marks the end of our discussion portion. Thank you very much. I feel that with all of this material now, we can actually ask some pretty insightful questions. And I do have one actually from Ramananthan, who asks, then looking forward, what is the possible solution for Tamils? And I would like to add that because we've discussed several venues during this discussion, so I guess through international pressure, through perhaps more regional appeals to India, perhaps more grassroots operations, then what might be the most effective way of getting their voice heard, I guess, amidst the context that we have now of a pandemic that is just going to continue already pretty present ethnic tensions.
Shall I take that? Yeah, okay. So so I would say, I mean, what is the kind of how, yeah, that's a good question. What is the solution? I think that it can have two parts, right? So how does Tamil advocacy continue? And I would say that it continues under very strange circumstances in the way that it has really done since the end of the war, which is this kind of network, a transnational network of people in the diaspora and activists on the ground. It is very loose. It's not centrally coordinated. It's a bit, as it has to be because of the security concerns, right? It's a bit haphazard. It's a bit sporadic, but that advocacy continues to kind of roll forward, and that pressure continues to roll forward. So there are spaces and there are opportunities in which to advance these cases. It just needs mobilization and organization to take them. And in terms of what's the solution, like what's the final solution, what's the constitutional solution, I always think that this question is so academic in the bad sense, right? In the sense of kind of pure speculation, because that Sri Lanka, before it moves to some future, it has to de-escalate. The conflict has to de-escalate, right? At every ceasefire, there has been clauses for normalization, which have never been met. So before we even think about what's the final constitution, I think we need to think about what needs to happen to normalize the North and East. But, one soldier to every 2 to 3 civilians, and we've done some numbers on this. There's nowhere that compares to that. I mean, it's so hard to find anywhere that has that level of militarization, right? Not even Kashmir, which is one of the most militarized places in the world, right? That's not normal, right? You can't think about constitutions when there's sort of amongst us, there'd be 2 soldiers watching us, right? What is there to think about when that's your reality? So I would say, let's not think about, what the final constitution looks like. Let's think about what are the avenues through which we get a meaningful, sustained normalization of the Tamil speaking areas, right? That means demilitarization, that means handing back of land, that means an actual open political space for people to engage in activities, a kind of possibility of economic regeneration through the diaspora, right? Because the diaspora rebuilt the Northeast, during the war twice, first after the ceasefire, then after the tsunami, right? So there's no need for this kind of devastation because the networks are there, the possibilities are there. It won't get through because everything has to go through the central government. And of course, for all kinds of good reasons, many Tamil people in the diaspora would rather not do that, sit down for an interview with Gotabaya Rajapaksa and explain what it is they want to do, right? Or hand over a bit of their assets, right, in order to be able to do development work or whatever it is. So I think I would say that the next steps are really thinking about where can we leverage pressure for normalization, for demilitarization, for a return to some kind of breathing space. And then once you get that, politics in the South will also have to change, right? Because if it's a sustained normalization, you can't have a central maypole of politics that is about who is the hardest on the Tamils. You have to solve your problems in another way, right? To think about politics in another way. And it's from that space, from those spaces that are created, I think, that whatever the constitutional solution is can emerge. But first, there has to be a normalization, I would say.
Right, thank you. And perhaps, Ms. Asher, you can jump in, and at the risk of asking you to explain your entire PhD, then how would you see the Tamil diaspora as playing into the transitional justice project in Sri Lanka?
I think as it has done before, it has to put pressure, the diaspora has to put pressure through host governments, to the international states, through the United Nations, like Madhura said, sustained pressure. It has to be urgent pressure. It has to continue. So I think that's one way of doing it. I mean, previously there was also more openness from the previous government to engage with the Tamil diaspora, but now, again, we don't see that. And the current, the Sri Lankan government is focusing a lot of its engagement economically. So maybe that is one avenue as well, through that kind of to enter into dialogue through that maybe is another aspect. But also, like previously as well, there was a lot of development projects and exchange programs for youth and lots of things happening in the ground through the diaspora and civil society groups and NGOs in Sri Lanka. But again, I don't know how much space there would be for that. So that is a kind of I think, engagement that should come or that can be expected from the diaspora. But right now, again, it's really unclear on how this will happen. Also, the NGO, there's an NGO Act that may pass, and that will also really restrict the funds coming in through NGOs, because that will also have to go through the central government. So all of that can really cause, again, blockages of the diaspora to engage directly with the country. So the best way is indirectly, I guess, is my answer to that.
All right, thank you. I know it was a lot to ask you to essentially distill what you've been researching for years now. So the next question comes from Sagi. So this actually goes back to what the quick chronology that Natasha gave us earlier in the discussion. So the UN Human Rights Council, he argues, he asks, did it fail, in your opinion, to support the transitional justice process in Sri Lanka? And if it did not fail, then perhaps he asks, how can the upcoming session of the Human Rights Council provide support for the process? So this goes to the question, I guess, of international pressure, but through the UN Human Rights Council.
So I wouldn't put so much pressure on the United Nations itself to say that it failed. It did do a lot. I mean, a lot of the funding to carry out projects, even the consultation process, a lot of the funding came through the United Nations Peace Building Fund. So there was a lot of support in that sense, but also they want to stand impartial, so they don't want to impose themselves and be kicked out from the country, for example. They need to also play safe in a way to be able to be in the country to effect changes. So they do act as a catalyst, I would say, in a way. They try to bring in expertise and bring in funds wherever possible. But in the end, it is in the hands of the government. It is the political will that really matters to take the process forward. There needs to be acceptance from the party for that. The second part was about the upcoming
the upcoming council, the new session.
I think there needs to be, I mean, when Sri Lanka did notify its intention to withdraw from the resolution, the Human Rights Council, what they did was encourage Sri Lanka to carry on to implement the mechanisms and carry on the work. I mean, I think there needs to be, I don't know, I think there needs to be more pressure maybe, and maybe be more firm in what the UN expects from its member states. And the UN did give a lot of time to Sri Lanka from 2015, again in 2017, again in 2019. So 2021 is crucial. So I think there needs to be a sort of firmness when whatever comes in 2021, there needs to be a firmness in where they stand and to ensure that transitional justice happens in the country.
Right, of course, thank you. So we have another question from Anova, and this might point more towards being answered by Madhura, but I believe both of you can give quite important answers to this question. So do you think Sri Lanka's issues are symptomatic of widespread movements towards nationalism in South Asia in general? And if so, do you still believe India and others could improve human rights practices in Sri Lanka?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so that's a good question. Obviously, there's been a shift to the Hindu nationalist right in India, and we've also seen in Bangladesh a kind of seems to be a kind of regression or a dilution of what were till then quite stable, democratic, contested, but nevertheless, reasonably open democratic contestation. So Sri Lanka in some ways predates a lot of these development. So if you just look at India and Sri Lanka, there's been a surge of Hindu nationalism in India, certainly since, the election of the Modi government in 2014, but even that, it's been escalating since the early 1990s. I mean, the thing that differentiates India from Sri Lanka is that India did have for several decades and continues to have to some extent a kind of institutional and a political culture of a more pan-ethnic and inclusive nationalism. So if you look at India's kind of handling, the religious question, perhaps not as good even in the Nehruvian era, but definitely the language question was resolved in a much better way, much better way in the 50s and 60s. And that's a legacy of that. And it continues to be reasonably stable. That's a legacy of that set of practices, that set of institutions, that set of way of framing a difference within Indian nationalism. And kind of despite the growth of Hindu nationalism and the relative power, absolute kind of massive majority that the Modi government enjoys, there are still kind of institutional remnants. There are still spaces in which it doesn't dominate. For example, in the South, much of the South, the BJP doesn't have much of a stronghold. So in that sense, the two, I wouldn't say that there's a global phenomenon of nationalism and it's operating in the same way everywhere. In every place, it has its local determinants, it has its local dynamics, and we have to look at what those are. And in many of the places where we see a resurgence of nationalism, it's actually kind of dynamics and forces and movements that have always been there, right? So whether if think about Trump and, racism in the US, right? Brexit in the UK, these are not surprising kind of developments if you look at their histories. So I would say that Sri Lanka's peculiar history of nationalism, somewhat different to India's. There are some similarities, and it's timing wise, it's also different. But also in terms of kind of what India's role would be, it's really important to note that Indian interventions, as with US interventions, as with any state, I mean, I tend to read it through a quite realist, materialist lens, right? These states intervene for their own reasons, right? Which are not always just crudely material. They have their own ideas of order. They have their own ideas of stability. They have their own ideas of economic interest. Sometimes it's woven in with human rights. Sometimes it's not, right? Remember, the US invaded Iraq in 2003, ostensibly to promote human rights, right? So, and Afghanistan in 2001 for the same reason. So I don't have a kind of idea of these states as coming into Sri Lanka just to do good. It's not crude material interest. They have other kind of political, strategic interests that they're pursuing. And in that process, they reshape what happens in Sri Lanka, right? And so throughout Sri Lanka's history, it's always external dynamics that have opened up space, but for different reasons, right? They've also reinforced the Sri Lankan state at other times. So I would say the fact that the Indian government is now Hindu nationalist as opposed to kind of Congress nationalist, in terms of what happens in Sri Lanka, doesn't make that much of a difference.
Right. So just a quick follow-up question then. How responsive do you think Sri Lanka would be then to Indian interventions in the way that you suggest?
They're not. They're absolutely not. And they never have been. So there's all kinds of reasons for that. One of the reasons is that there's a deep unease with India, right? That there's this idea that the Tamils are a remnant. Tamils on the island are a remnant of previous Indian invasions, right? So that the kind of the idea, it's much easier to really kind of have massive Chinese influence and presence in Sri Lanka than it would be to have an Indian presence and influence in Sri Lanka, right? And so there's this idea of kind of Buddhism standing alone against this Hindu-dominated continent or subcontinent, right? Even though Buddhism came from India, right? It came from somewhere in Nepal. So for all those kinds of reasons, it's generally resisted. But at the same time, the crude realities of power and size and international dynamics also play. And there are the realities of just the Indian size and its presence, but also just the kind of the sort of the Indian kind of cultural presence, if you like, right? So, I'm always surprised when I go to Sri Lanka, like, and I travel on the CTP buses, that you would have Tamil movies with Sinhala subtitles, right? And so, I mean, it always surprises me that this popular cultural stuff just seeps through. Saris, all of this kind of stuff, right? Going shopping in Chennai, that's not just the Tamils, right? I think it's politically not very responsive. I think if Sri Lanka could completely make an alliance with China that allowed it to be economically independent, right, whilst having kind of cultural links with the West and whatnot, and being able to get what it needed from India, that would be an ideal solution. But that may not be a solution that's open, right? That's possible.
Right. Thank you very much. So then continuing on from the, I guess, this realist perspective, then Natasha, if this is a question from Abel, if a transitional justice process is only going to work or will work most effectively with international actors or pressure from outside the diaspora through various channels, then how can we ensure that the process is very victim-centric if we do have these international actors who have their own agenda? Or do you think actually that there could be some kind of intervention from the international community that is a bit more altruistic?
It's a really good question, because a lot of the, even the transitional justice theories are criticized for being Western liberal peace theories, in a sense, where it does put a lot of it is top-down interventions, where the victim voices are hardly heard. I mean, I would say one way, like I said before, is proper, concrete, and coherent consultations that are properly recorded and taken into account when something is designed. So even the current UN resolution, it came from the top. It wasn't something that was designed participatory from the bottom or from the victims. So, I mean, that really needs to be taken into consideration, what the victims want from this process, because in the end, it's a process for victims. It's not for the government or the politics, which everyone tends to forget when you talk about transitional justice. So I would say it has to have that consultative process, but also it has to have independence and impartiality. The institutions have to be independent, where victims feel safe to go and speak and give witness statements and speak the truth and give facts. It has to be an independent institution in that sense, impartial and independent institution. I mean, having in a country like Sri Lanka, having international, for example, with the special court, having international judges, it took it nowhere. It was a no-go. But also internally, I don't know how strong the justice system is to handle it. So it has to be obviously it has to be a completely different system through transitional justice. But I mean, it's just honing in on the expertise within the country to kind of handle it. But again, it's very difficult to see it happening currently in this kind of political climate. But yeah, I think it has to be a fully participatory and consultative process.
So thank you very much, actually. So I guess finishing up, I would like to ask a last question, in the sense that it's probably, it kind of goes on to the whole realist regional politics and dynamics. So two questions were asked, one by Sahana, actually, and the other by Ramanathan, and I will combine them. So we have had two, I guess, pretty big influences in the region that quite recently would be China's quite active presence in the Indian Ocean and the Citizenship Amendment Act from India. So particularly considering the fact that the Tamil might have expected to receive support from the Indian government and did not get this support through the act, then how have these two events, or how can they perhaps impact stability, peace, I guess the future of Sri Lanka? And perhaps this is the question for either of you, Natasha, on the question of perhaps the diaspora, the effects that the Amendment Act has had on the Tamil population in India, perhaps, or any effect it might have had on the diaspora, and Madhura on the question of China's presence in the Indian Ocean. If you would feel comfortable to answer.
I'll let Madhura take it if she has a response for it.
So yeah, so I mean, I noticed that the CAA did not extend to the Sri Lankan Tamil refugees who are in India, who live in kind of appalling kind of conditions. And despite, whatever professed statements Tamil Nadu politicians make about Sri Lankan Tamils or the Indian government itself, nothing really seems to happen for the refugees who are there, who are kind of amongst the kind of Sri Lankan Tamil diaspora, probably arguably the worst off, right? Arguably the absolutely worst off. So, I mean, in terms of how the Citizenship Amendment Act is read by Sri Lankan Tamils in terms of India's actual kind of interests and intentions, I think most Sri Lankan Tamils, most political leaders, most Sri Lankan Tamils themselves have a kind of quite healthy suspicion of all international actors. Right. But it's kind of, I mean, I don't think anybody has a kind of starry-eyed view of some great state riding in on a horse to come and rescue the Sri Lankan Tamils. I think we've had 40 years of unending war, right, and repression, and nobody's come yet. So even amidst kind of absolute bloodbath, right, no holds barred bloodbath, nobody came. So I don't think there's any kind of starry-eyed expectation that India is going to ride in and rescue. I think what there is, and you will find this if you speak to grassroots protesters, people, the displaced peoples fighting for their land, or the parents of the disappeared who are like trying to figure out what's happening to their children, or just grassroots activists in Jaffna, for example. I'll give you a very quick example. In the 2016 US presidential election, some people in Jaffna, some activists, they held a puja praying for Hillary Clinton's victory, right? Now, they did not have some kind of starry-eyed view of what Clinton was going to do. They were quite clear that the Sri Lankan government could not have defeated the LTTE without US support. They're quite clear about that. They're not stupid. They follow international politics very, very closely, right? But what they see is this constellation is slightly better for us than this one. That's it, right? So we are living under kind of a boot, right? There's a boot on our neck. There's a knee on our neck, if I'm going to use a more, right? We're living up with a knee on our neck, right? We have very little power. We have very little agency of our own, especially since the end of the war, right? We have almost no leverage except for the diaspora. So it's the international constellations, some of these, for reasons not to do with us, but to do with the states themselves and what they want, right? In terms of order, in terms of pacification, in terms of stability, some of these constellations are better for us than other constellations. And I think that's why the Citizenship Amendment Act and the kind of exclusion of Tamils from the Citizenship Amendment Act, it wasn't really kind of it hasn't caused much of a ripple in Sri Lankan Tamil politics or diaspora politics, because the fact that nobody expects states to act in the Sri Lankan Tamil interest per se, right? Remember that the Tamil diaspora is now actively lobbying, actively engaging Western states, which during the final days of the war heavily armed the Sri Lankan state whilst prescribing the LTTE. Right? The height of the war in early 2009, the dynamic was, until the end of 2008, Western states backed the Sri Lankan state and had prescribed the LTTE, right? Within 9 months, the diaspora had switched because they said, there's a space for us here. So I would say that, in terms of the realism, I think you'll find that the Tamil activists and some of the Tamil politicians that I speak to are the most cynical, not cynical, but the most kind of pragmatic, really, right? This has been 40 years of being on the wrong end of international power. So, right, we've had 40 years of being on the wrong end of international power. Nobody has illusions about big states riding in to help a small and fairly insignificant minority.
I don't think I can top Madhura's response because that was basically spot on. But what I'd like to, I mean, in response to the question about the diaspora, when we do, I mean, look at influence of the diaspora, we always consider the diaspora in the West because they're quite much more established. They have permanency in the West compared to the Tamils diaspora, the refugees in India, right? So with this, I would say it really it makes it seem like in Tamils in India may not be able to influence Sri Lankan politics in that way, if I'm not mistaken.
Of course, yeah, thank you. Madhura, do you have anything to say to that?
Yeah, no, I would agree. I think that the Tamil refugees, I mean, it's not really a diaspora. They're in a kind of funny holding position. They have zero capacity to influence Indian policy. And I think Indian policy is also often read wrongly as somehow the influence of Tamil Nadu. It isn't. It's not Tamil Nadu specifically that wants to access to the Colombo port. It's just the Indian state as a whole that wants access to the Colombo port, right? And wants stability in Sri Lanka. So I think there's almost no influence for the Sri Lankan Tamils in India. And even I think the influence of Tamil Nadu sometimes is kind of overplayed in my reading anyway.
Natasha, do you have any last remarks?
No.
Okay, then on this sadly realistic conclusion, then I guess we must also conclude our discussion for the evening. So Ms. Natasha Pansuria and Dr. Madhura Vasarasanam, thank you both for taking the time to join us for this event and for sharing your expertise on an issue that, whilst all its complications, it still often flies under the radar. So the SILF and law faculty are truly honored. And to our delegates, thank you all for having joined us for this discussion. Please keep a lookout for future events. As the title might suggest of this event, this is the first in a series that we will continue to explore throughout the academic year. So thank you all again. Thank you in particular to Madhura and Natasha. Thank you so much and have a fantastic evening.